And anytime you use more than one mic on a single source, you want to obey what's called the 3-to-1 rule, where one mic is 3 times the distance away from the source as what the other mic is. So if the first mic is 1 foot away from the source, the other mic has to be at least 3 feet away from the source. And if it's like 2 feet away, then you're going to have some phase issues because it's too close.
You're listening to the GWNL-Podcast. Guys with no lives talking about audio.
Hello and welcome to episode 20 of Guys with No Lives podcast. Because we're never sure of what the name should be, we're talking about delay techniques and effects. Do they has effects or not? That was a funny play on words. I hate myself.
Not has effect.
Delay techniques and the has effect. Does it has an effect or not? Well, we know that. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that voice. It does has an effect. The Haas effect, actually. But we're talking about delay techniques. And so I just want to say one of the things that I use a lot is the Haas effect to my advantage, because you get a lot of stereo width from using delays, and the Haas effect, which is technically anything under 40 milliseconds, is not 2 sounds, it's 1 sound. Your brain interprets it as a single sound. That's all the Haas effect is. And so you can use that to your advantage as a mix engineer, and that's how you can thicken things and make things seem more stereo interesting. That's a technique I use all the time, and I love it. I love the Haas effect. It's my best friend. Haas.
Haas is your best friend?
Yeah, it's Dr. Helmut Haas.
With 3 C's.
With 4.
Thick.
4. Thick. But no, what about you guys? What are some of your favorite delay techniques? Let's rock and roll with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, we talked about what delay was in a previous episode, so yeah, it's true. We're going into techniques. I mean, I like to use delay for a lot of things. I mean, first of all, as we've talked about, delay is just the one audible repeat as opposed to reverb that has a ton of different repeats, and so it can be used as a reverb alternative. So there's a lot of times there's parts in a song that you put a little delay on it, and it creates that depth that you would have gotten from reverb, and it's fine, and you don't have to do any reverb. A lot of times you have to do delay and reverb. A lot of times you put reverb on the delay, which is actually really cool. So you put the send on the delay return and send that. And sometimes I'll have something that's dry, it has a delay on it, and then the delay has reverb, but there's no reverb on the actual thing. And that could be really cool to be something really subtle. So that's one thing. The other thing is making sure it's with the tempo.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a rhythmic tool. And it's super cool that way.
I'm a really big fan of kind of like a ping pong delay type sound. So I don't know, get that ping ponginess. How would you describe that, Ben? I don't even know how to go about describing like a ping ponginess. It literally feels like it ping pongs between the two, like left and right.
Because of the left-right spread.
It's a stereo delay, and it alternates between left and right speakers on it.
Yeah.
So,
this is then getting to a little bit more of an advanced technique made famous by Daniel Lanois. So a lot of people call it the Lanois shimmer. It's basically using delay and reverb together with some like pitch shifting and then some like low passing to essentially create this really like cool high delay synthy sound. And so if you like run a guitar through it or like a high piano sound through it, it just creates this really cool ambience. And I guess that's more of a reverb effect though. But
but that's important. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's kind of a little bit of both. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're essentially using a delay, a reverb, and then an octave shifter as well to essentially get it. Well, I know we don't really like rave about like one manufacturer over another or plugin company over another, but Sound Toys developed a plugin called Crystallizer that basically does that all in one with some other weird like reverse granular stuff that's really cool. So give that a shot if you haven't. Just fun to experiment with.
I mean, again, a lot of the tools that I have found that delay is a really good way of bringing things out in a mix rather than turning up the volume of something. And that kind of stereo engagement actually can, again, because of like psychoacoustics and other things. Psychoacoustics.
Yeah.
Acoustics.
Well, I'll also use a delay as a doubling function sometimes.
Yeah.
I was recording a guitar solo for a song, and I wanted to have it triple tracked, but the guitarist, it was more of like a kind of fusion type song, and the guitarist, ended up improvising something, and they're like, "Can you play that again?" And we just didn't have enough time in the studio for him to relearn what he had improved. And so to kind of like save on time, I ended up taking a tape delay plugin that was stereo and using that as a send. And the left side was like delayed by like 10 milliseconds. The right side was delayed by like 20 milliseconds. And since they were panned out, left and right, and then you have the dry signal up the middle, it just sounded like this huge, like triple tracked guitar that ended up sounding really, really cool. And the client ended up really liking that guitar sound. And so I was like, oh, cool. Just had this like cool vision of it and was able to do that with tape delay.
Yeah, that's one thing I like to do with just like when I put a delay on. I mean, there's some delays that are like stereo delays, but when I put a mono delay on a stereo return, I always make sure that, I mean, it depends on which DAW you're in, but where you have control, like dual mono control. And so I'll do it so that I find the setting I like, and then I'll take one side and just tweak it by a few milliseconds or 10 milliseconds or so. Yeah. And that just makes it so that each side is just enough different that all of a sudden it sounds like this cool stereo thing. And so the delay effect, and maybe there's like some pitch shifting on there and stuff like that. Maybe I'll change the pitch shifting a little bit, but it's just so that they're slightly different than each other. Sometimes I'll make, if the delay is exactly in time, like eighth note, I'll make the right channel a little longer than an eighth note and the left channel a little shorter than an eighth note.
Yeah.
So that they're like a little bit before and after the actual eighth note. And so now they sound like the stereo thing. Whereas like common stereo delay is like 16th note on the left and eighth note on the right, like the ping pong. And so sometimes that's a little too like
aggressive delay, yeah.
So that you can do the more subtle thing is just to take that. And a lot of plugins will have they'll have a dial that's just like, I can't remember what some of them are called, but it's where it will, like, okay, you're at a quarter note, which is
like an actual
milliseconds, and they'll have a dial that's just like smudging it a little bit.
Like so like a groove knob.
Yeah, groove. That's
groove
what
dial.
A lot of times. Yeah, some of them call it that. And so you adjust that, and now it's like 251, 252, and that's basically to do that same thing. I mean, it can be used if it's like the exact quarter note is like not in the groove, and you can adjust it. That's what it's for. But it can be used when you make them dual mono independent from each other to make it like this cool, like subtle stereo thing. So.
And kind of going back to the doubling function of like basically creating a faux or a fake double with delay. That's why I like using a tape delay, because the tape delay does add some of that modulation stuff that we like kind of talked, the pitch shifting stuff that you had brought up.
Yeah.
It'll kind of emulate that. And so your left and right channels are going to sound a little bit different because of that sort of like tape emulation.
Like what you want.
Yeah,
because
when
it's unnatural to hear the exact same sound in two locations at once. It literally does not happen in nature.
Well, it creates phasing issues when they're the exact same. And so if you're using like a digital delay that's not doing any modulation, you may run into some phasing issues. And so when that sums down to, like, if you listen to it like on a phone or like on a system that sums that down to mono, it's not going to sound as big
or nice.
Well, and even some of these, like I was saying, this subtle like stereo thing, if you change them by a couple milliseconds, it's creating a phase issue, and that's what's creating your stereo width. And so it does affect your mono compatibility, which a lot of presets, I mean, nowadays they're all samples and they're stereo samples, but back in the old days they would make like a sample, like a patch stereo, by like putting on some phasey effect on it to make it stereo. But that's the one that, going along with what Bryant was talking about, the technique I like to use is where, like, I call it making mono stereo. So you have a single source, and and you like pan that to the left and you pan to the right, something with kind of this is kind of the Haas effect sort of thing. You pan it and you put it like 5 or 10 milliseconds sort of thing. And you're messing with, because there's, for directionality for psychoacoustics, there's 3 ways that we hear, like, you know, that something's coming from different direction. And the first one is like level difference, so it's louder in one ear and softer in the other. The next one is time difference, and that's where the Haas effect sort of thing. It's earlier in one and later in the other. And then the third one is where it's filtering around your head and stuff like that. But you kind of use the first 2. So like, let's say that on the left is your dry one, and on the right is like 5 milliseconds delayed. So obviously if you listen to that, your brain is going to be like, oh, it's coming from the left because it's 5 milliseconds earlier than the right. Okay. But then what you do is you turn down the dry and you turn up the wet. So according to level difference, it's coming from the right, but according to time difference, it's coming from the left. And you adjust that until it feels like it's coming from both sides. And now your brain is saying, oh, well, time-wise, it's coming from the right or the left, and level-wise, it's coming from the right. So your brain's like, it's coming from both sides. And so that makes us monosource, like, kind of sound and feel stereo. And it's really weird because you have to turn it way down on that dry one. And it looks weird because it's, like, super low on the left and super hot on the right. But it sounds like it's coming from both spots.
Yeah. Psychoacoustics. Should we touch on flanger and chorus and how they correlate to delay?
Yeah, so I think we kind of hit upon these before, that the chorus is just a short delay that then you modulate the delayed signal with, like, modulate the pitch through your
modulation,
your rate and your rate and depth. So it's an LFO, and it's affecting the pitch. The flanger, it's an LFO, but this time the flanger is affecting both the pitch and the delay time. And it's
a really cool, like, example of this. There's a Sum 41 song, and actually you can look this
pop punk
my
example.
man.
Of course it is. Anyway, you can actually look this up on YouTube. Tom Lord Alge goes through kind of like basically remixing that song and trying to get as close to the original version with like plugins. And so he uses like an Eventide plugin to do the flange, because back when he actually created it, he actually was like had a tape machine and he was adjusting using like Verispeed on the tape machine to adjust the speed of the flange track, and then blending that in with the full like mix track. And so it's like right at the part where it's like the bridge before they go into one of the last choruses, you'll hear this like kind of like cool like windy spaceshipy sound, and that's the flange thing.
Yep. So. Yeah, and really it is important to, understand like ADT versus flange. So the ADT is kind of the original effect that the Beatles did, where they're actually having two tape machines synced up and kind of slowing down one by grabbing the flange of the tape is how some of the stories say it. And then it speeds back up to catch back up, and so it gets a little faster, and then you grab it and it slows down. So that's the real, and there's plugins that actually create the ADT effect, whereas a flanger is using an LFO to try to create that same effect, but it's different. And so they really are kind of two separate effects, because there's all those inconsistencies that are happening with a tape machine as you're doing that. So the ADT plugins are recreating that, or you can just sync up two tape machines and use that to make the effect.
As the live sound guy who does this and does system tuning, we talk a lot, and I think in stereo and in studios we talk often about the benefits of using delays and using delay to add interest into a mix. In live sound, I have to deal with all the problems of delay and time alignment and phase alignment and losing those things. So one of the challenges that I have with my job, and we're talking about delay, and this can also kind of go with, and this is a miking technique, but it's related to the concept of delay. I'm miking a large ensemble, like a concert band or an orchestra. Well, how do you mic that band? Well, you can set up zone mics to cover those zones, but there's going to be a certain level of phase issues that you're going to run into. So think about the snare. If that snare drum in the back of the ensemble gets hit, whatever, that transient is going to peak at different times across those mics as that sound travels forward with those mics.
Because they're all different distances from the snare drum.
From each different microphone that's on the stage. And if you have, 20 or 30 microphones, that's a bit of mess to some extent. And so those are some problems that you have to manage in certain ways. And from what I have dealt with in my experience as a sound engineer is that the way that you set up your system, not the way you plug things in, not the way that you do those things, like that you run signal essentially to them, but the physical position that they take in physical space has a major effect on that phase issue, because you can add comb filtering into things. And it's funny because there's actually this big difference between the horizontal versus the vertical plane of listening. You will have more phase issues in the horizontal plane than you will in the vertical plane. So that's why line arrays work the way that they do. But that's a whole nother thing. So lining your left to right alignment as well as your sub alignment with your left to right speakers makes a big difference in causing those kinds of weird comb filtering issues. Likewise, center fills are meant to fill in the gap between your left and right speakers. If you push those too hard, you can actually introduce more noise and cancellation and weird summation and cancellation in your center if you do it wrong. And they have software to help calculate those things and manage those things. That's like, smart software, as well as like L-Acoustic has their own stuff. A bunch of different companies have their own things. But it's something you have to be aware of, both on the input side of your stage and on the output side of your stage, how delay will affect those things.
Yeah,
something along those lines is like if you think of like a kick drum, like in a rock band scenario, a kick drum is pretty darn loud in and of itself, but then miking that up, as the drummer hits that, since the drummer's backstage, that signal is going to come through the sub before that signal acoustically in the air reaches the same place. And so you can get kind of this like almost slapback with that, which can also cause some phasing issues. Like, it can cause some serious phasing issues. And so a lot of times live sound engineers will delay their subs just a little bit. That way there's phase coherency between the kick and the sub.
Well, that's why they have the backline. That's why there's the term called backline. Is you line everything up with the kick. And that's why you see all the amps are like on the same plane as the kick. And then you delay all of those so that they arrive acoustically the same time.
At the same time that the
speakers.
sub is triggering through the speakers.
Yeah,
now
and the mains too, but you're delaying your backline because they're so loud. Like guitar amps and your drums can be so loud that they're being heard acoustically as well as through the speakers. And then so you delay them, and it's just
you line them up and then you delay them so that and it's literally as simple as how many feet from them to the fronts to your mains.
And it's pretty close to just a foot as a millisecond. So
it's 1.1 millisecond per foot technically. Exactly. And it's a little bit more precise than that, but 1.1 is close enough.
Yeah, it depends on humidity and temperature too.
Yeah.
Most digital consoles have like a delay feature though that you can dial in.
Yeah.
If the X32 and the M32 have it, then others have to have it.
Pretty much all of them do.
Yeah.
I will even add this to that. So one of the other things that you can do to manage some of your stage noise as a live sound engineer, and this is a benefit of delay, is a cardioid or an end-fire sub-array, which works in some instances and in other instances is not really viable, which all it is you're basically using subs. You're pointing one sub for a cardioid, you're pointing a single sub in reverse, and you're pointing two subs forward, or two subs in reverse and one sub forward. In reality, it's the rear sub that is sending sound, that is sending the actual sub sound forward, and you will invert the phase of the opposing subs. So like if we have 2 subs forward, 1 sub back, the rear sub is going to get their phase inverted, I believe, and then you're going to delay it by the distance, by roughly the distance between the drivers, essentially.
Or you physically line up the drivers.
Right.
And then there's no delay needed.
But that doesn't always look good, and that's the other reason why you won't physically. You may not see it physically aligned in the same sense, because we're talking driver to driver, not box to box. That is different.
Well, and that's what. So I was just talking about this today with the guy at the school. We have like 10 of these dual 12 subs that they're actually pretty 12s? Cool. But they're the K subs by QSC.
Oh, okay, I'll accept that. I'll accept the K subs.
And so they're actually really cool 12s. So usually 12s for subs. Yeah, kind of lame. But so we got like 10 of them, and so I'm like, we need to like do an experiment, and they're like tall and long, and so you could easily put 2 forward and 1 in the middle in the back, and just get them figured out to where they are acoustically, where they line up, and then we'll put tape across as where they line up, and then you can just set them up and you line up the tape, flip the phase of the one firing backwards, and now you got a cardioid array. And then like 3 of those subs is going to be pretty dang awesome and really focused, but yeah, that's all dealing with phase and delay, like you said, you have to delay it, and then you have fills too. If you have fills out in your audience, you delay those by the same distance that they're away from the backline.
And it can be very complicated depending on how your satellites and fills are set up on certain things. Now, there's obviously the simple, like you have delay towers that are going like in line with your mains. You have the fronts, you have your mains, then you have your delay towers, which are however far back from the mains. Like these are for major concert festivals. I feel like Europe does this more than we do in America, because European concerts are something else. Sorry, like I kind of envy Europe as far as like concert production goes, because like I'll tell you one thing: don't mess with Germans in their concerts, man. I'm gonna tell you that right now. But
the fact that tons of our gear comes from Germany,
don't mess with their microphones either.
Yeah,
so.
man.
Yeah.
But no, delay towers. You simply do those math calculations. Nowadays, it's a lot more complicated, and they have more powerful software where they're actually going through and doing CAD models and actually doing modeling of dispersion patterns and like doing things more automated that way. There's still technical knowledge associated with it, but the old-fashioned way was, I mean, honestly, we go back to the Grateful Dead and the Wall of Sound, not the recording Wall of Sound, the Wall of Sound, where it's just amps and speakers just
all in the same,
talking about the backline. But like today, you have those, and if they're in line with the mains, you have a relatively simple delay. But if you have outfills or something angled to a different direction, and like people are listening from those directions, and I'll be real honest with you, most concert technicians and most concert like speaker setups for like those kinds of arrays where they have outfills as well as delay towers as well as the satellites and other things, they're not going to be stressing so much about like phase coherence or like accurate phase reproduction from the main stage, because it's too much work and not enough. And you're sitting in the ear bleeding seats, or the seats they don't care about, that aren't
the nosebleeds.
Yeah,
the nosebleeds. That's the word.
You didn't pay enough for us to spend time making it sound good for you.
Yeah, and so it's one of the, and like it sounds bad and sounds really rude, but it's like they can only do so much, and event promoters are trying to squeeze out as many dollars as they can from the concert. But that's how delay is used a lot in, like, not from a mixing perspective, but from a technical perspective in live sound. Those are the things that you'll use. And I want to say one more thing, because I didn't get to explain end fire sub arrays, which are slightly different but important.
I do want to get back to the capture part of it that you talked about.
I would like to also go back to that, because that's a whole nightmare too.
Well,
because
let me cover that. Talk about that sub. Yeah. What's that sub? You were going to say.
Oh, okay. I can actually talk about end fire subs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then we'll get out of the reproduction part and we'll go on the capture.
So where cardioid is where you're using essentially an odd number of subs to create a cardioid array, which is how it works. You can actually create a cardioid array, I think, with this like even numbers as well, and that's where an end fire kind of takes over. So you have 2 subs facing backwards and 2 subs facing forwards, and I'm going to make this point here because I didn't say it earlier. Subs are omnidirectional. Though there is a driver on one side, the sub sound emanates in an omnidirectional pattern, polarity-wise. So to get those kinds of cardioid arrays, which also teaches you a little bit about how microphones work. Anyways, you have to face 2 subs forward, 2 subs backwards. The 2 subs that are faced, I believe, backwards are going to have their phase rotated, and you're going to delay them, much like you would do for the cardioid. And you're going to base these things off of your lowest fundamental tone as well. That distance and what tone you're going to be running through is going to be based off of your lowest tone that you're going to produce in that sound system so that you can get that accurate pre-production. But it's similar to the cardioid where you're facing one backwards, you're inverting the polarity, and then you're delaying I believe the front subs, actually, not the rear subs, but the front subs to direct the sound forward and not onto the stage so that you can minimize low frequency interruption or low frequencies on the stage so that the musicians can have a more enjoyable time on the stage. That's not always possible due to some like sub setups and some sub arrays, but that's essentially what an end fire is. The only difference is that you're doing it with an even number. And I think they're all technically forms of cardioid subarrays because you're directing the sound forward, but you can do it with an odd number and an even number. I'm just making stuff up now.
But yeah, basically what it's doing is it's acoustically, canceling out the sound that's going back.
If you ever watch those, you should, side note, if you ever haven't, you should watch those videos where they take a metal plate and put it on a tone vibrator. That's what it's called. The Sladney plate or whatever. Yeah.
And they'll put, I don't know how to pronounce it.
I don't know but it's like they basically take this metal plate that's on a vibrator that's hooked up to a tone generator. Then they put sand or some other dirt medium onto it. And essentially where the sand doesn't move is the nodes, and the antinodes are the places that are clean on that plate. As you turn up the frequency, it increases the complexity of the pattern. As it's a lower frequency, it minimizes that. Anyways, it's really cool. You should check it out. It's very directly related to what we do in sound.
Yep.
Your turn.
Okay. So yeah, to get to the capture part of things. So as Joe was talking about, as you were talking about the snare drum being picked up in all the different mics. And that gets to, there's a couple ways to avoid that. And we deal with that a lot with just like a drum kit in general. And anytime you use more than one mic on a single source, you want to obey what's called the 3-to-1 rule, where one mic is 3 times the distance away from the source as what the other mic is. So if the first mic is 1 foot away from the source, the other mic has to be at least 3 feet away from the source. And if it's like 2 feet away, then you're going to have some phase issues because it's too close. Once you get past 3 feet, that the distance, the delay between the two is enough that it's going to be negligible.
Negligible, yeah.
On it's going to sound like the Haas effect or something like that. It's going to thicken it up or something, or it's going to sound like a delay. But then, so you deal with that all over the place in the drum set because you have bleed from the different mics. So the other part of that is what you can do is you can time align your tracks, so your drums. And they would do that in the old days. They would really try to do it acoustically as much as possible. And then if something sounded weird, you'd flip the phase on the microphone. Like commonly, if there's a top snare and a bottom snare, you got to flip the phase. And a lot of times you just test the phase and you're like, does that sound better or worse?
Does it sound hollow or does it sound full?
Yeah, exactly. And then but nowadays, once we record it, we can look at the waveforms and you can say, oh, look, the kick is recorded from the front, but the overheads are kind of behind the kick, and so they're out of phase from each other.
Right.
Let's flip the phase of one of them. And then, this is earlier or later, so you kind of pick one thing to line everything up to, and you make sure that when a kick hit happens, it's getting picked up on the overheads at the same time as it's getting picked up with all the tom mics, and the same thing with the snare, that the snare is getting picked up with the kick mic and with the overheads. And so you kind of line those all up, and then things sound a lot cleaner and tighter because that phasiness makes it loose.
I will say that... Yeah, go on.
I was going to say that also helps like fatten your sound up too.
Yeah,
like you'll notice. You'll notice that beforehand, before things are like really phase aligned, that can sound a little bit thin, and then once they're like perfectly in phase with one another, It's like, ooh, nice. Got that like fat snare.
I'm going to be the devil's advocate because I kind of hate how clean things are these days, and I kind of hate how loud things are. And it's funny coming from the live sound guy about loudness. But like, sorry, this is like a crusade now that I'm on, I've decided, because I don't, like, I see that all the time. I see time alignment in these things, and I see it all the time. And I think there's a certain level that's good, but I feel like to some extent we, in our time period now, we've gotten so accustomed to hearing things like perfect to some extent. And I say that not to the detriment of electronic dance music, but EDM especially, where they can 100% be perfect. Yeah. That I feel like they're the worst culprits of this phenomenon of perfect alignment that is just kind of lame. It's just dead to me. It's not really exciting. There's nothing interesting about it. And you know this because like the really top-notch like electronic producers will introduce more of that acoustic nature, acoustic vibe, that not so clean, not so perfect. You don't want it perfect, you want it closer to perfect, but you don't want it perfect. And it's one of those things where like that time alignment really kind of, sometimes it's too much, or they might just replace the drums and now it's perfect.
Yeah. Use some drum replacer tool.
There's
right?
too much cleanness.
No, and that applies to so
dirty.
many things. Like that phase, like that's the thing. Phase is not necessarily bad because it happens in real life and it's real.
Yes.
And that's what the phase difference is, what creates stereo sounding, and that's how we can tell where things are coming from, is that phase difference. So it's good. It's good.
And having those phase differences in like a multi-mic setup where it's like a live performance, like someone doing a vocal and an acoustic guitar at the same time. A lot of times you'll hear like people kind of rave online about, oh, bleed's bad. I don't want any bleed. I don't want to record these at the same time because I don't want bleed, because they think they want more control in post-production. But sometimes having that bleed kind of adds like a coherency to the recording. And in some cases, some artists perform better if they are playing their instrument as they sing. And so it really comes down to finding out what's most in the studio setting, comes down to what helps the artist be, deliver their best performance, so you can capture that, and then you work around them essentially.
You can learn a lot about an engineer if you ask him, and we used to do this at my old shop. We do this as a joke, but kind of a real thing. How do you mic an elephant? And it's a weird question, but like we're talking about that delay, and we're talking about what types of aspects of that. If you think of an elephant as an instrument, what types of things you want to capture from that? And the other question that's a little less weird to ask an engineer: how would you mic a rock band, or how would you record a rock band? Because like right there, that'll tell you kind of what battles they want to fight, what things they don't want to deal with. Because these days, you can record everyone completely separately, and no one really will bat an eyelash at it. But there are some people who do better, like you're saying, tracking it all together, and sometimes the vibe is better, but maybe the musicianship isn't as good. And there's benefits and drawbacks to both of these. You do everything individually, it kind of can sound soulless if you do it the wrong way. If you do everyone in the same room, you're going to run into more mistakes from the musicians. And so like managing these things like with physical management of delay as well as digital management of delay, and how people do those things kind of tells you a lot about what they want to deal with and who they are as an engineer.
Who they are as a person.
Their soul.
So yeah, delay. There is a lot of, I know we kind of got off on an interesting tangent.
This is all about delay. I don't want to hear this kind of negativity right now.
But it is interesting, like dealing with a large ensemble that you're trying to capture, and like the placement of your microphones and dealing with that issue. Just like I said, it's like a drum set is the same thing, just on a smaller scale. And drum set's tough because it's so loud, and you have multiple mics on it, and each mic is going to pick up all these loud elements, especially the kick and the snare.
Yeah,
they get in like everything. So,
and the hi-hat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi-hat.
High SPL or high frequency.
That freaking hi-hat, man.
Yeah, especially the open hi-hat. It's like, what the? there was this one drummer at the school, and his hi-hats and the way he'd play, it was like it didn't matter what I did. I had to record. I helped him get recorded multiple times.
Yeah.
And every time he'd do it, as soon as he started playing open hi-hats, it was just like it took over the whole kit.
Everything.
And it was like I turned the hi-hat mic down all the way, and it doesn't make any difference because it's just in every mic.
Take it off axis or get some distance. The battle you're going to run into is that phasing issue, but like I don't know, distance.
No, that's the thing.
That's one of those things that you have to. You know, I would talked about like making the artist comfortable and stuff, but that's one of the things where you have to actually talk to the person about their technique.
Yeah. And that one is
you got to be lighter on the hi-hat.
Yeah, it was the combination of the hi-hats and how hard he played it. And it was just like I noticed it on multiple projects. And then I have other students record him, and I listen to their recordings, and I'm like, oh, there he is. He's playing open hi-hats, and it's just taking over everything.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like the technique would need to be adjusted for that.
For sure.
So, anyways.
That's delay.
Delay.
Mix good. Good luck, don't suck.
Delay well.
Delay good.
Do not bad at delayness.